So it's time for another release of Home Assistant. There's not masses of functionality this month, but there's some still really nice features, and there's some with some building blocks to build on in the future. So let's go through the features at a top level first, and then I'll dive into a couple in a bit more detail. So it makes sense to start with the new onboarding functionality. So now you can search by address when you're setting your location, rather than faffing around with the map. This is useful because there's various automations that you can use that use this feature, for example when the sun sets and rises. And the next one is more language translations, this time for services. And the great thing about Home Assistant is that the whole community can contribute. So if you're multilingual, then please consider contributing yourself. I'll leave the link in the description on how to get started. The great advantage of Home Assistant and the community over big companies is that big companies either have to hire a lot of people or outsource this to do this, where in Home Assistant we can do it for free. So the next piece of functionality is somewhat of a gimmick in my opinion. Having said that, I've created a whole video on it already. So if you want to check out generating AI images in Home Assistant, then check out my video on DALL-E above. In summary, it allows you to type text or speech into the assist in Home Assistant and it will generate an image based on what text you've put. The next new feature is to the shopping list. Now this is a piece of functionality that I don't use but I feel like I really should. So now you can add things to your shopping list using assist, so typing or via voice. You can only add one item at a time at the moment, but I imagine in future releases I'm sure they will add the ability to add more items at once and also delete items, which you can't do at the moment. So the next functionality is somewhat geeky, and that's wildcards. So basically you can add parameters to assist so that when you say a sentence, if it matches that sentence that you've defined, then you can pull out certain bits of that sentence and put them into variables, and then you can do something with those variables. I think this is setting up for the future, whereby hopefully eventually it can start to replace the likes of the Amazon Echo and the Google devices. The next one is a new event entity, and I think this is going to get a few people excited because events in Home Assistant are somewhat clunky to say the least at the moment. So this is available for MQTT and Philips Hue and a couple of other integrations at the moment, but I think it'll expand over time. You can think of an event of something that happens which only really has one state. So if you think of a light bulb, then it's either on or off, and you might care about either of those states. Whereas something like a doorbell, you only really care about when the doorbell's being pressed. You don't care about when your finger has been released from the button. So I think this will become a bit more clearer when I dive into detail later. Now the next one is something that I think should have existed a while ago, and that's conditions in blueprints. Now if you don't know what blueprints are, they are basically templates for automation so that you don't have to create them from scratch. I find myself always creating them from scratch because there's always a little something that it doesn't do. Whereas with these conditions, you can basically have them in there so that you can customize the blueprints a bit yourself. So this might hopefully persuade me to start using blueprints a bit more. So other things to note in this release are that the Xiaomi integration has now got capability for the MyScale device. Unify has got capability to have QR codes for Wi-Fi, and also you can enable and disable Wi-Fi, so I'm definitely going to take a look at that. There's a new Gardena integration, so if you've got the water smart control by Gardena, then you'll be able to control that from Home Assistant. And there's lots of other tweaks and bug fixes in this release. So now let's take a deeper dive into some of them, starting with wildcards. When you're talking to Assist, you have to be fairly specific with what you're saying. But the idea is that wildcards can make this a little bit easier, and you can pull out parts of a sentence and do something with them. So let's take a look in more detail. So when you use Assist to say something, then it triggers an event. And if you go into an automation and do add trigger, then you'll see there's this sentence trigger here. And this is what I've created here. So I've created two triggers. I've got one which is I love something, and then one with I hate something. And then I've given it a trigger ID to add to a shopping list or to remove from the shopping list if I say I hate something. So if I say something to Assist which matches the format of this sentence, then what it will do is it will try and pull out what you've said, and in the parts of the sentence you've said it will store the first bit into item 1 variable and the second bit into item 2 variable. So for example, if I said I love apples and oranges, then apples should get stored in here and oranges should get stored in variable 2. And then if we take a look at the actions, we can see how we actually use these variables. So firstly, add to shopping list. So I've got a trigger here to say if the trigger is add to list, which is when you say I love something. So it's going to do two actions, one to add the first item to the shopping list and another to do the second item. That's because you can't add multiple items to a shopping list at the moment. So if we look in more detail, you can see here that it's a fairly simple command. So you've got the service shopping list.add item that you call, and then you pass in the name of the item. And here, trigger.slots is what is saved from the trigger of what you've said, and then the name of the variable here. If we look at the next one, it's a little different. So what I've done here is I've added a filter of replace, and that's because when you say something, the assist functionality adds a full stop at the end when you've spoken to it. So you need to remove that full stop, otherwise it'll add the full stop to the shopping list, and then if you go to remove it again later, it might be a problem. And then the remove items shopping list action is exactly the same basically. All it is just calling the remove item service instead. Now for shopping list, it might not be the best of examples because as we've seen, there's new functionality in this release already to be able to add to shopping lists from assist. But this allows you to add multiple items, which you can't do yet. But you could do a lot of other things as well. These actions are just an example. You can perhaps use this functionality for creating calendar events as well, or maybe even storing something into a Google Doc or a Google Sheet using the Google Sheets integration. So now let's take a quick look at it in action. So if we look at the shopping list, you can see there's no items on it. And we'll go back to overview and then press assist. And now I'm going to try and add two items to the shopping list. I love apples and oranges. Now let's go to the shopping list and you can see apples and oranges have been added. Now let's try and delete them. I hate oranges and apples. And there you go, you can see I said it in the opposite order and it still removes them both. So now let's talk about the event entity in a bit more detail. So this is useful for entities where they've only got one state rather than two or more. So if you turn a light on and you've got the two states like I mentioned earlier, then once you've turned it on, the next thing you have to do is turn it off. Whereas say if you're pressing a doorbell, you press the doorbell and then it changes to pressed, and then someone comes along later and it changes to the same state again. So you can't really use an entity like an input boolean or anything like that, because once it's changed state to a state, it won't change back again on its own. So this is where this comes into play. So in Home Assistant, I've created an MQTT device with an event entity, just to demonstrate exactly what I mean. So if we go to doorbell here, we've got three virtual buttons I've created here. So this is just to simulate the doorbell itself and the different presses that it could do. So in reality, these would be a physical button. And then down here, we've got the event. So every time one of these is pressed, this event should get fired. And it doesn't matter if it's the same event, it will still fire again. So if I press single press, then you can see it's changed now, 1 second ago, etc. But if I press the same one again, then you can see it's fired another event for the same thing. And this is trickier to do with other types of entities. And this is why before you used to use the events functionality in Home Assistant, but it was a lot more trickier to use. You'd have to go to developer tools and figure out what the exact events were. So with the event entity, if we click into it and then click the cog, we can see that it's got an entity ID here. One thing I've noticed is that if you do add automation, it doesn't seem to exist here as an action at the moment. But if you go and create an automation from scratch, then we can go to add trigger, and then we can do add state, and then we search for the entity, and you can see there's event.doorbell here. And then under attribute, there's event type, and then you select to and single press. So if we look at the history of the automation, you can see it's not being triggered at the moment. But now if I go back here and do a single press, and then go back, we should see that it's been triggered. So you can see that event type came through of single press. One thing I've noticed is that I'm not sure if it's working totally properly at the moment, because if it's already on a certain state and you trigger it again, it doesn't seem to re-trigger the automation, which is the same problem as using another type of entity that has two states. If I press single press again and go back to the automation history, you can see it hasn't triggered again, which it should do. Whereas if we look here, you can clearly see that another event has been created. Well, that's it for this video, so please comment down below with your favourite features for this release. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and liking the video if you haven't already. So thanks, until next time.